Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. So go ahead and dim those lights, fluff that pillow. Maybe readjust your blanket for the 17th time like you're trying to find the correct medieval sleeping posture. Because tonight we're floating into one of those very specific jobs from history that absolutely nobody romanticizes. Except maybe the occasional architecture student who's had too much coffee. And that job is ringing cathedral bells in medieval Europe. Yes, the giant bronze noise machines dangling 100 feet above solid stone. The ones that look peaceful from the outside and are basically chaos gremlins on the inside. So, let's drift up those narrow stone steps, step over the suspiciously dusty cobweb situation, and settle into the world of the medieval bell ringer. And pretty quickly, we're going to realize why yes, you with your modern human spine and your preference for breathable air, would absolutely not last a single day in this job. But don't worry, we're going to take this journey slowly and calmly, like we're sipping lukewarm monastery wine. Nothing thrilling, nothing startling, just the cozy misery of a profession that combined loud noises, bad air, supernatural beliefs, and of course, medieval workplace safety standards, which were approximately zero. All right, let's drift in. So, picture yourself in a medieval cathedral town around the 13th century. You somehow landed the gig of bell ringer, maybe because your cousin knew a guy who owed a favor, maybe because no one else wanted to do it, or maybe because you were the sturdy-looking one, which is medieval code for, we think you can pull ropes without immediately keeling over. And like most jobs in the Middle Ages, your career choice is less about self-fulfillment and more about, well, this seems marginally better than starving. Now, first thing to know, churches weren't just churches. They were the local clocks, the alarms, the breaking news alerts, and the community's emotional support system. Bell ringers set the rhythm of daily life, prayer times, feast days, emergencies. Hey guys, the market's open. And occasionally the dramatic, please stop fighting in the streets chimes. Basically, you were the medieval version of every notification sound on your phone, but heavier, louder, and more likely to detach your shoulder. Let's float a little closer to your living conditions, though, because as a bell ringer, you're already starting life on hard mode. Most were poor, undertrained, and constantly inhaling enough dust and bell metal particles to qualify their lungs as archaeological artifacts. Jobs usually didn't come with health insurance, by the way. Your health plan was, try not to die in the bell tower, please. And now here's a fun detail historians love to mention casually. Bell towers were notoriously filthy. No one was sweeping up there. The stone steps were basically medieval stairmaster equipment, dusted with pigeon droppings, random mold colonies, and thick layers of grime that probably contained the spiritual signatures of every ringer who came before you. Not glamorous. Not comfortable. Not great for your sinuses. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, so let's climb up those steps, slowly, gently, one creaky step at a time. Some towers were so tall that you'd climb for 10 or 15 minutes straight. And this is before ergonomic railings, before airflow considerations, and definitely before the concept of maybe ventilation is good for human survival. One account from a French bell ringer in the early 1400s describes the ascent as a weary ascent spiraling into darkness, which is medieval person speak for, I hate this job so much. By the time you reach the top, you're sweating, dehydrated, mildly dizzy, and the actual work hasn't even started yet. Waiting for you are the bells themselves. Massive bronze beasts weighing anywhere from a few hundred pounds to several tons. Bells so big they got names, personalities, sometimes even baptisms. Yes, baptisms, because of course they did. Medieval Europeans baptized bells thinking they could ward off storms, demons, or whatever essence of chaos was making the crop sad that year. So the bell you're ringing, its name is probably something like Maria Gloriosa or St. Thomas the Tremendous, and it absolutely does not care about your fragile mortal frame. Now, your main job is pulling ropes. So far, that sounds easy. Kindergartners can pull ropes. But cathedral bells don't behave like kindergarten toys. A large bell swings like an angry pendulum on a mission. Pull too hard, the rope snaps back and slaps you in the face. Pull too weakly, the bell lurches, stalls, and then drops its entire momentum straight into your arms like a disappointed parent falling onto a couch. Get the timing wrong, enjoy the sensation of being hauled off the ground entirely. Yes, bell ringers were sometimes lifted into the air like medieval kites. Some accounts tell of ringers getting flung across the room or smashed into beams. There's even a story of one poor guy who got wrapped into the rope so thoroughly that he completed a full upward swing and had to be cut down afterward like a human wind chime. But all of this, amazingly, is still not the biggest reason why you wouldn't last a day in the job. Because the biggest issue is the sound. Let's float into the acoustic nightmare for a moment. Bells were designed to be heard across entire towns, which means when you are inside the tower, they're basically screaming directly into your skull. There are modern physicists who've measured the decibel levels of large bells at close range and concluded that prolonged exposure can cause ear damage in minutes. Medieval people didn't have decibel meters. What they had were complaints like, "After the feast bell, my head did ring for many hours," which is a quaint way of saying, "I think the bell rearranged my brain." Imagine standing beside a giant bronze bowl that's being struck over and over inches from your head. No earplugs, no OSHA regulations, just raw acoustic violence penetrating your soul. And some bells were so loud that ringers were required to plug their ears with wool, which helped approximately 0%. The vibrations pass straight through your skull anyway, like a shout from the universe telling you to reconsider your life choices. And if you think you could simply endure it, remember, bells weren't rung for 2 minutes. Mass bells could ring for 15, 20, sometimes 45 minutes. Weddings, funerals, coronations, even longer. If someone important died, congratulations, you're ringing until your consciousness detaches from your body and floats into the rafters. Now, let's talk about the physical health aspect. Medieval people already had terrible ears due to constant exposure to noisy environments like markets, metalworking shops, shouting, and, life. But bell ringers were in their own special category of hearing loss. One English historian notes that long-term ringers often went deaf early in life, and many developed permanent ringing in their ears, the medieval version of tinnitus, except without the modern explanation. They usually blamed it on demons whispering or on ill humors, which honestly feels fair after hearing 20 tons of metal resonate next to your skull. So that's the sound situation. Constant, overwhelming, skull-rattling noise paired with early onset hearing loss. Extremely cozy. But wait, don't settle in too peacefully, because there's another delightful detail: the floor. Bell tower floors weren't always secure. Some were patched with wooden planks, some were cracked stone, and some had gaps that allowed ringers to look straight down into the church interior. Not exactly the most comfortable place to stand while swinging heavy ropes. Some towers shook from the force of the bells, some swayed in the wind, and at least one chronicler mentions a tower that did tremble most fearsomely, which is medieval historian language for "the entire structure tried to dance, and I did not appreciate it." Combine this with rope snags, rope burns, rope whiplash, and the possibility of the bell mechanism malfunctioning, and suddenly your evening shift at the cathedral becomes a fun gamble with gravity. But again, were not here for excitement, just gentle, mildly tragic medieval working conditions. So let's take a soft breath and float over to the next problem, the superstition factor. Medieval churches were deeply spiritual places, and bell towers were often believed to have a kind of mystical importance. People thought bells could chase away storms, demons, plagues, and even bad vibes. Basically, the medieval equivalent of a Bluetooth anxiety diffuser, which meant bell ringers were expected to run up the tower and ring during thunderstorms. Yes, thunderstorms. Those towering metal structures reaching into the sky, they were lightning magnets. Bell ringers occasionally got struck or electrocuted, though the medieval explanation was usually God's judgment rather than this is a terrible idea and physics hates you. Tonight, we're going a little further, because ringing the bells was just the beginning. The tower wasn't just a workplace. It was an ecosystem. A weird ecosystem, a tiny vertical kingdom of rope burns, strange rituals, religious pressure, embarrassing accidents, and the occasional pigeon who wholeheartedly believed it owned the place. So let's float gently into that side of things. Living in the tower, aka the medieval version of being on call. One thing modern people tend to forget is that ringers weren't simply clocking in and clocking out. Many lived in or near the church because their job required constant availability. If someone important died at night, you'd better be ringing that funeral toll before the body cooled. If a visiting noble arrived unexpectedly, congratulations, ring the welcome bell and pretend you weren't asleep in a corner like a medieval cat. Some cathedrals even had tiny sleeping niches carved into the stone, cramped alcoves where ringers kept blankets, broken stools, and maybe a sad piece of bread. These weren't glamorous monk cells. They were more like storage cupboards with personal identity crises. Imagine waking up each morning, stretching your sore arms, looking around your dim little corner of the tower, and being greeted by cold air, rope ends, bits of straw, maybe a resentful pigeon, and the faint smell of heated bronze. Just a very normal, very soothing medieval morning. Breakfast, if you're wondering, was whatever the local clergy remembered to give you. Sometimes bread, sometimes broth, sometimes nothing, because the priest was distracted by his own theological meltdown that week. And you didn't complain, because the church wasn't exactly known for encouraging employee feedback forms. The social status of bell ringers, technically important, socially invisible. Now, in theory, bell ringers played a major role in daily life. In practice, they sat comfortably at the bottom of the church's unofficial popularity ladder, somewhere below choir boys, but above whoever cleaned the gutters. Most clergy viewed them as necessary fixtures, rather than co-workers, kind of like animated pieces of bell tower furniture. You existed, you pulled ropes, and that was that. One monk from the 1200s described a bell ringer as a man most diligent, though he speaks seldom and is often not well, which is medieval monk language for, we barely know this guy, but he looks tired. Ringers weren't clergy, they weren't lay brothers, they weren't nobility, they weren't even full church employees sometimes. They were around, an odd presence drifting between the sacred and the functional, which meant if you died in the tower, and yes, that happened more often than anyone likes to admit, you might get a respectful burial, or you might get a quick burial and a shrug. It depended on whether the bishop liked you that week. But let's glide away from that mildly depressing detail and drift towards something more whimsical and equally strange. Bell baptisms. because nothing says holy metal like sprinkling water on 3 tons of bronze. Yes, bells were baptized with holy water, with godparents, with full ceremonies. Bells weren't just objects. They were spiritual tools believed to hold power over storms, demons, and general misfortune. So the church treated them like enormous metal parishioners. There are records of bells named Maria Consolatrix, Vox Dei, Saint Michael the Thunderliker. Yes, really. And my personal favorite, the Great Peter, which sounds like a tavern nickname gone wrong. Now, when a new bell arrived, the ringer's job was to help the clergy prepare the ceremony. This usually meant cleaning the bell, a process that involved scraping old soot, dust, bird gifts, and general tower residue off its surface. Cleaning a medieval bell was the kind of chore that made you question your entire life trajectory. You'd be scrubbing a giant bronze bowl while the clergy chanted prayers, and you're just hoping you don't sneeze loudly at the wrong moment and get blamed for bad harvests. And after the blessing, the bell would sometimes be anointed with holy oils, perfumed, wrapped briefly in cloth, or have herbs placed inside it. And you, the ringer, would stand silently beside it, absolutely exhausted, but pretending to be spiritually uplifted by the experience. Meanwhile, the clergy got wine afterward. You got to carry the empty jug back. Strange bells, stranger superstitions. Let's settle into the quieter superstitions for a moment. The ones whispered by ringers who'd been working in towers for decades. Some believed bells absorbed emotions. Some believed the bells liked or disliked certain ringers. Some claimed a bell could refuse to ring properly if it sensed dishonesty in the person pulling the rope. Honestly, after inhaling tower dust for 20 years, you might start believing bells had moods too. There were also superstitions about when not to ring. Never ring between midnight and dawn unless absolutely necessary. Never ring during childbirth, lest the bell confuse the angels. Never ring if a bat was flying near the mechanism. Apparently bats were omens of mischief, and the last thing you wanted was angering whatever spirits were supervising medieval rodent behavior. And yet, most of the time, the ringers ignored half these rules because the clergy gave orders like ring at dawn, ring at matins, ring at terce, ring at sext, ring at none, ring for the feast, ring for the procession, ring because I said so. Some days you wondered whether priests were just inventing excuses to ring bells because it made them feel important. The physical toll, sore arms, and permanent bell ringer hands. Ringing a cathedral bell wasn't a cute little tug-tug motion. It was a full-body workout that medieval people somehow managed without stretching, electrolytes, or self-care routines. Long-term ringers developed what one modern historian calls bell ringer musculature. Overbuilt shoulders paired with worn, cracked hands. Basically, your upper body resembled a medieval blacksmith, and your lower body resembled a person who climbed stairs constantly but regretted it deeply. There were also delightful afflictions like rope burns that smelled faintly of charred hemp, bruises from being yanked upward at the wrong time, dislocated shoulders from mistimed pulls, lower back pain from constantly leaning and bracing, and of course, tinnitus because the bells were trying to sing you into retirement. One chronicler described a longtime ringer as shaped like a barrel above and a child below, which is rude but also probably accurate. But ringers did gain one thing: endurance. Medieval endurance, the kind that develops when your daily survival depends on not being flung across a stone room by a sentient rope. Let's float into the tower animals. Bell towers were like unwanted Airbnb listings for small medieval wildlife. Pigeons? Everywhere. Bats? Always. Barn owls? Sometimes, staring judgmentally from rafters. Mice? Constantly auditioning for louder roles. Ringers didn't love sharing the tower, but the animals weren't exactly asking for permission. There are dusty little notes in parish records about ringers who kept informal friendships with resident owls, because a tower owl ate mice and therefore deserved respect. One ringer in 1380 wrote that, "An owl kept good watch, and that he spoke unto it when lonely." A very relatable medieval moment. A little melancholy, a little sweet, and very on brand for someone whose workplace was a vibrating stone cylinder. Of course, animals in the tower also meant droppings everywhere, feathers drifting into your hair, and the occasional bat flying directly at your face at 2 in the morning. But you'll learn to coexist. The tower was a kingdom, and you weren't really in charge. Accidents. The quiet, embarrassing kind. We're not talking dramatic falls, we're staying calm tonight, but the tower did produce some awkward, sleepy catastrophe moments. Ringers tripping on their own rope loops was common. Ringers getting lightly bonked by the bell when leaning too far was common. Ringers dropping personal items into the nave below was very common. Imagine a quiet morning mass and suddenly someone's boot falls from 80 feet up and lands near the priest. Most clergy pretend it didn't happen. Most ringers.
Tonight, we're easing into the night side of bell ringing. Because if you thought daytime ringing was unpleasant, try doing it in the dark, alone, with the wind whispering strange things through the rafters, the pigeons asleep in judgmental little lumps, and the bells towering above you like metal ghosts waiting to shout. So let's relax into the quiet creepiness of it all. Without anything sudden, of course. Just the gentle, melancholic weirdness of nighttime tower duty. Night bells. The midnight calls you definitely didn't want. Medieval towns didn't have consistent clocks. They had bells. And those bells needed to ring at very specific canonical hours. Matins, lauds, and sometimes smaller nighttime observances. If you were unlucky enough to be the designated night ringer, you didn't sleep normal hours. You slept in strange medieval time fragments, waking up to climb the tower over and over. Imagine it. You're half asleep, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, lying on your wooden cot or in your chilly tower niche. Then you wake up, not because of an alarm clock, but because your brain has developed the ability to sense bell o'clock. You rub your eyes, sigh deeply, and climb those stone steps by candlelight. Maybe the candle sputters, maybe it goes out entirely, and you just grope your way up, hoping you don't kick a pigeon or trip over a misplaced rope coil. Once you reach the top, the tower isn't peaceful. It's a different kind of alive. Quiet, but not quiet. The kind of silence that feels like it's observing you. And your job is to break that silence with sound so loud it could theoretically wake the dead town elders 3 streets away. Congratulations, you are now the world's sleepiest alarm system. The sound at night. Somehow worse. During the day, bells blended into the noise of markets, carts, people shouting, and the general medieval ambiance of life but louder. But at night, the sound hits differently. A toll in the dark echoes longer. The reverberation feels deeper. And since everything else is asleep, you hear every tiny vibration. Some ringers wrote that the bells seemed louder at night, Not scientifically louder, of course, but spiritually louder. The tower shook, the air trembled, and the vibrations sank right into your bones like a sleepy little earthquake. One chronicler claimed that ringing bells at night made him feel as though the entire world were stirring with me, which is poetic, dramatic, and also a sign that he really needed a nap. But let's drift further into the emotional side of this job. Funeral bells. Slow, heavy, and emotionally draining. If you were a medieval bell ringer, you were intimately familiar with the funeral toll. Slow, deliberate, spaced widely apart, each ring meant to echo sadness across the town. And you didn't just ring for nobles. You rang for children, laborers, clergy, townspeople, travelers who died inconveniently close to the parish boundary. Some days you rang for 3 or 4 funerals. Some plague years you rang for so many that you stopped counting entirely. A ringer's job was not to grieve, but to keep time. Yet the psychological toll adds up. Standing alone in a tower, pulling a slow, heavy rope for someone you didn't know, feeling the whole structure tremble with every lamenting note, it does something to you. The bells didn't care that you were tired. They didn't care that you hadn't eaten. They didn't care that you just rung the same pattern yesterday and the day before and the day before that. A medieval bell ringer's emotional world was a strange blend of numbness and routine reverence. Not dramatic, not sentimental, just quietly heavy. One anonymous parish note simply reads, "The ringer grows weary this year." Probably the most understated burnout statement in medieval history. Storm bells, the most dangerous, least effective tradition. Let's float gently back into the storm rituals, the ones that literally put bell ringers at risk. Medieval Europe believed that bells could ward off thunder, lightning, hail, and maybe even the entire concept of weather. This was partly because bells were considered holy tools, partly because people needed something to blame storms on, but mostly because medieval science was, let's just say, still in its experimental poetry phase. So when thunder cracked across the sky, guess who had to race up the tower? You? Of course you. And you'd ring like your life depended on it, which is ironic because your life actually did not depend on it, but your death kind of did. Bell towers are tall, bells are metal, and lightning likes tall metal things. Modern historians estimate that dozens of ringers were killed this way over the centuries. Not all at once, thankfully. This wasn't a dramatic lightning war situation, but quietly over time. And still the tradition persisted, because the bells sometimes seemed to work. Not because they repelled storms, obviously, but because medieval people were very good at remembering the times something seemed effective and conveniently forgetting the times it definitely wasn't. So storm bells became a ritual. A slightly heroic, deeply misguided, very damp ritual. And ringers participated out of duty, fear, and a touch of, well, maybe this time it'll work. Ghost stories. The tower folklore nobody wrote down formally. Bell towers became the perfect breeding ground for ghost stories. Not demons, not monsters, just gentle, unsettling tales exchanged between ringers trying to stay awake during night shifts. Stories like the bell that rang once on its own at midnight, a sound of footsteps on the stair when no one was climbing, roped shadows moving strangely in torchlight, a cold gust that always came from the same corner, or the classic, "I swear I heard someone whisper my name once during matins." None of these stories were ever meant to scare. They were meant to explain the tower's natural weirdness. Because when you're alone up there, half asleep, surrounded by ropes twitching gently from old drafts, and listening to the faint rasp of bats shifting on beams, your brain starts improvising. And medieval people didn't say, "Oh, that's just physics." They said, probably a spirit. Anyway, nothing dramatic, just casual spirits. Polite ones. The kind that didn't bother you unless you were already in a bad mood. The strange comfort of the bells. Here's the part no one expects. Some ringers actually found the bells comforting. After years of working in the tower, some grew attached to the sounds. Not because they were pleasant, but because they were familiar, steady, predictable. The bells became a schedule, a rhythm, a reassurance that time was still flowing even when everything else in life felt chaotic. Some ringers wrote about the bells like old friends. "I know the feel of each rope like brothers. The bell speaks as I pull. It is a great comfort hearing the tone, though it be loud." You wouldn't last a day in the tower, but long-time ringers lasted decades, because the chaos eventually settled into routine, and routine became its own kind of peace. A loud peace, sure, but peace nonetheless. The psychological weirdness of tower life. Now we float into the quietest, strangest part of the ringer's inner world. Being alone in a tower changes you. It slows you down. It rearranges your sense of time. You spend hours with nothing but ropes, dust, distant echoes, and the emotional weight of bells meant for birth, death, prayer, warning, joy, sorrow, and every moment in between. Your thoughts stretch out. Your senses sharpen in some places and dull in others. You think about things slowly, like you're stewing your brain on low heat. Some ringers became deeply introspective. Some became oddly philosophical. Some grew socially awkward because they spent more hours with bells than with people. A bell ringer might hear a wedding bell ring and think, "Ah, love," then immediately follow it with, "The rope smells musty today." A perfect...
So tonight, let's drift a little deeper into the quiet chaos of your would-be daily routine. Nothing dramatic, of course, just slow, steady, mildly unfortunate vibes. Let's gently shuffle forward. Now, picture this. Dawn is creeping in. Not beautifully, not like modern Instagram sunrise aesthetics, more like a grayish smear of light reluctantly crawling over a city made entirely of damp stone and unresolved sins. You wake up because someone is already banging on your door. Not in a friendly, "Hey buddy, let's get breakfast" way, but in that medieval, "Are you alive? You're supposed to be doing things" way. And outside the door stands a low-ranking cleric who absolutely hates you. Let's talk about him for a moment. Because every medieval cathedral had at least one of these men, the eternally irritated clergy member with nothing in his life except passive-aggressive authority over the bell ringers. He's the guy who thinks he should have been studying theology in Paris, but ended up supervising whether you tugged the rope at exactly the right moment. It's a tragic arrangement for both of you, really. He knocks again, louder. There's no snooze button. There's just the weight of responsibility and the knowledge that he will absolutely report you for slacking. So, you roll out of bed like a sack of flour someone dropped in the street and walk to the cathedral where the bells already seem to be judging you. And they are. Medieval bells were basically the HR department of the Middle Ages. Loud, intrusive, and constantly reminding you of your obligations whether or not you wanted to hear them. Now, today is what we could call a mid-tier liturgical day. Not a feast day, not a boring weekday, just one of those in-between days where you still have to ring the bells a lot, but nobody appreciates it. These are the days where your hands already hurt before you even start. You look up at the ropes. They look back. Or at least, it feels like they do. Before you start ringing, though, there's something else you have to deal with. Acoustics. Modern people love to imagine medieval cathedrals as these huge, echoing marvels of engineering, and they were, mostly. But the thing nobody tells you is that inside the bell tower, the sound was less beautiful chorus of ancient bronze and more your brain vibrates like a bowl of soup someone just smacked. There are historical notes from visitors describing bell towers as unapproachable during ringing, which is medieval historian language for your ears will cry blood. So to avoid going deaf too quickly, because bell ringers did go deaf, just very slowly, you had two choices. Stuff your ears with wool, which doesn't really help, and also makes you look like someone preparing for the world's saddest winter cosplay, or pretend everything is fine. The medieval default strategy. So you take a breath, put your feet in the right stance, not too far apart or you'll slip, not too close so the rope will smack you in the face, and begin the slow, steady, mind-numbing work of tugging a giant rotating metal monster into motion. Now here's a fun thing about medieval bells. They weren't standardized. Not even a little bit. Every bell was handmade, meaning it might be heavier than the records say. It might ring in a different pitch than expected. The clapper might swing unpredictably, or, my personal favorite, the entire bell might be just slightly lopsided for its entire existence. Which means you, the bell ringer, need somehow to predict the mood swings of a 1,200-pound bronze diva. And remember, everyone in town is listening. This level of performance anxiety is why bell ringers tended to be slightly twitchy. Now, let's float into a more personal part of the job, the politics. Every medieval workplace had politics, but cathedral politics were uniquely spicy. You had the bishop, who pretended not to notice anything, the canons, who noticed everything but only complained selectively, the archdeacon, who enjoyed being feared, the choir boys, who are almost certainly planning some sort of tiny chaotic rebellion, and you, who is just trying to not ring the wrong pattern and cause theological drama. Because, yes, ringing the wrong bell sequence could get you yelled at for theological reasons. The medieval mindset was magical like that. If you rang the morning call 2 minutes early, some canon would insist that souls were being confused. If you rang too late, suddenly you're accused of being spiritually sluggish. If your rhythm was uneven, congratulations! The entire town now thinks you're hungover. And you probably are, because this is medieval Europe, and beer was literally safer than water. Speaking of rhythms, let's talk about the patterns, because ringing wasn't random. You had specific sequences for matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, non, vespers, compline. Basically, at any hour, there was another obligation. And if you weren't sure which service was next, you could try asking another ringer. But ringers were notoriously bad at keeping track of time because they generally couldn't see clocks, and the bells were the clocks. So everyone was guessing. There is something very comforting about imagining 3 exhausted medieval bell ringers trying to decide whether it's time for sext or whether they missed terce entirely because the rope jammed again. They would huddle together, squint at the sky, and say something like, "Looks like maybe mid-morning?" This is precisely the level of precision medieval society operated on. Now let's drift upward, figuratively, not physically because we don't want you falling, into the upper bell chamber where the big bell lives, the one with a name, because medieval people loved naming bells. You'd have bells named Gabriel, Mary, Trinity, Big John, Hope, or in one famous case, the voice of doom. And once a bell had a name, it became slightly sacred. You had to treat it like a cranky family member. Never swear in front of it, never touch it without permission, and definitely never sit on it, even if it looked like a very comfortable seat. There's a record of a bell ringer in 1294 who sat on a bell between rings. A cannon caught him. The man was punished for irreverence and probably had to scrub the cloisters for a week. This is why bell ringers never smiled. Now let's ease into another gentle hardship, the ropes. The ropes were not soft. They were not nice. They were not kind. Imagine handling a rope that's basically the medieval equivalent of a cat scratching post, except the cat is a massive bronze bell and the scratches go both ways. Ringers would wrap their hands, but even then, blisters were an unavoidable part of the profession. A chronic, ongoing, never-ending romance between your skin and rope burn. If you rang multiple bells a day, which you did, you'd develop little calluses, then bigger calluses. Then your hands would just become these mysterious, rough medieval instruments that scared small children. People wrote poems about church bells, but never about the bell ringers, probably because nobody wanted to romanticize your hands. Let's float into the lighter side of medieval bell culture. Superstition. Every town believed slightly different things about bells. The general themes, though, were bells scare away demons, bells stop storms, bells purify the air during plagues, bells make the crops better, bells prevent the dead from becoming restless. Basically, bells were the medieval version of a multi-tool. But here's the catch. If something went wrong in the town, like a sudden illness or a storm or a crop failure, people might blame the bell ringing. Specifically, you. Because clearly if you had rung the bells properly, with the correct cosmic energy or whatever, the wheat would not have gotten moldy. There's even a medieval chronicler who implies that a poorly timed bell ring contributed to a local famine, which is of course wildly inaccurate, but also very on brand for medieval logic. So, on top of everything else, you now have the existential burden of being blamed for weather patterns. And now very gently, let's drift to the part of the job nobody ever wants to think about, the maintenance. Bells needed a lot of upkeep. The wooden frames rotted. The iron bolts rusted. Pigeons did unspeakable things everywhere. The ropes wore down, the wheels cracked, and sometimes the clapper just fell off. If a clapper fell off, everyone panicked, not because it was dangerous, although falling iron chunks from 200 feet up was not ideal, but because the bell now sounded like a depressed cooking pot. And guess who had to crawl up into the structure to fix things? Yes, you. Imagine crouching in a wooden maze, holding a lantern, praying you don't drop a tool into the choir loft mid-service. Your clothes catch on the beams, you get cobwebs in your hair, you inhale so much dust your lungs start compiling a new book of complaints. Meanwhile, the cleric supervising you keeps saying helpful things like, "Hurry, we need it ringing properly for Vespers," as if the bell cares about Vespers. Let's settle the lantern down for a moment and rest in this quiet truth. The life of a medieval bell ringer looked impressive from the
Let's drift a little deeper into this life you absolutely would not survive. You've made it farther than most, honestly. If this were an actual medieval bell-ringing apprenticeship, you'd already have sore hands, a stiff neck, chronic resentment, and at least one rope mark somewhere on your face. But since this is a bedtime monologue, you get to float peacefully onward, while your imaginary medieval self continues to suffer quietly. So, tonight, let's talk about feast days, emergency ringing, and the specific kind of dread that settles in when someone from the clergy says, in the most casual tone ever, "Ring until the bishop is satisfied," which is the medieval equivalent of,
We don't know how long this will take, and we don't care about your well-being. Now, feast days. This is where your job and your misery really shines. A normal day requires maybe 5 or 6 sessions of ringing. A feast day requires ringing so often that your arms start filing their own resignation letters. Important feast days? Even worse. And saints' feast days? Well, let's talk about that. Medieval Europe was obsessed with saints, to a degree that feels kind of adorable now, but was probably very annoying for anyone who had to ring bells about it. Every town had patron saints. Every cathedral had relics. Every relic had a day. Every day had bells. Some feasts lasted 8 days. Some involved processions. Some involved ringing bells for so long that people described it as joyous and continuous. Which means you, standing in a tower, sweating through your one wool tunic, are performing something called joyous and continuous labor, which is a lie on several levels. On days honoring the town's patron saint, you're expected to ring with enthusiasm, and the clergy will notice if you don't. Not that they could hear the difference, because they were far away, safe in the choir, where their ears remained blissfully intact, but because enthusiasm was a spiritual quality. And somehow, that was your problem. Now, let's drift into something even worse. Emergency ringing. The bells weren't just for prayer. They were also the medieval version of a group text. Loud, unavoidable, imprecise, and usually stressful. Here are a few reasons someone might demand the bells be rung immediately. A fire in town, a flood, a riot, a noble arriving early, a noble arriving late, a noble deciding not to arrive but nobody telling the bell ringers, an unexpected death, an expected death, a coronation proclamation, a battle nearby, a threat of battle nearby, or my personal favorite, something unsettling in the sky. Medieval meteorology was basically, whatever that cloud is, it looks concerning. And when these emergencies happened, someone would run, usually dramatically, into the cathedral and shout, "Ring the bells, now." This is not a calm request. This is a panic request. This is someone saying, "I'm scared, and therefore you must also be scared." And you, being the bell ringer, cannot simply say, "Sure, give me a minute." No. You have to sprint to the tower like your life depends on it, even though the situation is almost never improved by rapid bell ringing. But hey, tradition is tradition. Now, let's sit with this for a moment. Emergency ringing is dangerous. Why? Because bells are not designed to go from peacefully still to frantic mayhem in 10 seconds. If you pull the rope too hard too fast, the bell can swing unpredictably. It can twist the rope. It can jolt you off your feet. It can yank you upward like a medieval theme park ride that was absolutely not built to code. There are documented cases of bell ringers being lifted several feet into the air because they pulled the rope during an emergency without bracing properly. One chronicler describes a man being raised heavenward by the bell's zeal, which is poetic language for The bell threw him. And yes, sometimes people got injured. Not fatally usually, but enough to guarantee the next several days were full of very pious complaining. Now, let's gently wander into the most nebulous, most dreadful, least measurable instruction a medieval bell ringer could ever receive. Ring until the bishop is satisfied. This instruction is both extremely specific and absolutely meaningless. Because what is satisfaction to a bishop? 10 minutes? 20? An hour? Until he finishes his sermon? Until he finishes lunch? Until someone reminds him that bell ringers exist? There is no standard. So what you do is you stand there, ring the bell, and wait for a messenger boy, one who's definitely being underpaid, to run up the stairs and shout, "The bishop says continue." The boy has no breath left. You have no soul left. It's a mutually draining scenario. Meanwhile, the bell keeps swinging, your arms keep aching, and the bishop keeps not giving clear instructions, because medieval leadership was basically 70% vibes. The bishop, meanwhile, is somewhere warm, probably eating fish stew and thinking, yes, this sounds appropriately festive. Now, let's drift into the oddest part of feast day ringing: coordination with other churches. Because every church had its own bells, and every church thought its bells were the important ones. And sometimes they all rang simultaneously. This caused acoustic chaos, spiritual enthusiasm, and an absolute migraine for you. There are cases where towns complained about unseemly clamor during festivals. But instead of coordinating with each other, the churches simply rang louder, because that's the medieval solution to basically everything. So you, in your tower, are desperately trying to maintain rhythm, but St. Michael's bells are going too fast. St. Mary's bells are slightly off key. The Abbey bells are ringing in a completely different sequence. The parish bells sound like someone dropped them, and your bells are giving up and slowing down. It's like a medieval version of everyone trying to sing different songs simultaneously. Very holy, very unpleasant. But nobody blamed the system. They blamed you. Now, let's drift down from the tower, mentally, so you don't fall, and settle into something quieter. The soundtrack of your entire life. If you imagined a bell ringer getting used to the sound over time, that's very sweet. Very optimistic. Very incorrect. Bell ringers did not get used to it. They lost hearing gradually in a slow and deeply inconvenient way. The constant vibrations altered their sense of balance. People wrote about bell sickness, a kind of dizzy, buzzing fatigue. Some ringers complained that even when they slept, they could still hear the swinging. Imagine lying in bed at night, trying to drift off, but your brain is still ringing in the key of, "Please stop." This is when monks would tell you to embrace the suffering as spiritually purifying. Which is nice for them to say, because they're not the one getting blasted in the face by bronze resonance all day. Let's wander into another challenge: nighttime ringing. Certain observances required bells at strange hours. Imagine being warm, well, relatively warm, in bed, wrapped in the medieval equivalent of a blanket made from anxiety and sheep, and someone knocks on your door. You already know it's bad. It's the cleric again, the one who hates you. His torchlight flickers ominously. He says, "It is time." Not in a dramatic way, just in a "this is your life and it is endless" way. Then you have to pull yourself out of bed, put on your slightly damp boots, and trudge through the cold, dark streets to the cathedral. The entire city is asleep, except for you. The tower stairs feel steeper at night. Your lamps barely illuminate anything. Every sound echoes. You half expect a ghost, but the only haunting presence is your growing resentment. And once you reach the bell room, you realize something. If you're still with me at this point, you've now fully committed to the slow, inevitable suffering of a medieval bell ringer. Good for you. Or, sorry, hard to tell which. Tonight we're drifting up into the eternal enemy of medieval cathedral work, the weather. Because as much as the clergy like to talk about divine order and the harmony of creation, it really seems like medieval Europe was specifically designed to ruin your day. Let's float into it. Slowly, like a damp breeze pushing through an unsealed window. The weather will absolutely betray you. Most medieval occupations happened at ground level, where weather was annoying but survivable. You, however, work at the top of a giant stone tower, basically the most exposed structure for miles. So when it rains, you are the first one to know. When it snows, you get a front row seat. When the wind blows, it hits your face like the medieval version of a slap delivered by God himself. And let's be clear, these towers were not warm, not cozy, not insulated. They were stone chimneys with openings big enough to let in entire gusts of Northern European despair. Your job is to go up there no matter the weather. Because the bells do not care if you can't feel your fingers, can't see the stairs, are soaked through all layers of wool, or suspect the wind is trying to murder you. Duty calls, loudly, literally. Rain, the moist, unkind reality. Rain is the most frequent inconvenience. Not romantic rain, not, ooh, nice ambiance rain. Just wet, persistent, slightly chilly water that ruins everything. Rain turns the steep stone stairs into slippery death spirals. It soaks the ropes, making them heavier and harder to pull. It drips through the roof beams, creating little puddles in the bell chamber. And rain plus medieval boots equals, well, let's call it dangerous optimism. Because the moment you step wrong on wet stone wearing soles made from whatever the local cobbler could find, you're one dramatic slip away from becoming part of the cathedral's floor plan. And don't forget, rain muffles sound, which means you have to ring harder. So when it rains, your workload doubles, and your enthusiasm, predictably, does not. Wind, the tower's favorite murder weapon. Wind at ground level is bothersome. Wind at 200 feet is a full personal crisis. Some towers had open arches right at bell height, designed purposely to let sound travel. Unfortunately, they also let the wind travel, right into your face. Medieval accounts say wind howled through bell towers, which is quaint. What they meant was, it screamed directly into your eardrums and tried to push you off the platform. Wind could yank ropes unpredictably, swing bells harder than intended, destabilize wooden platforms, blow out your lantern, and make your cloak flap so violently you felt like a disgruntled bat. And let's be clear, these towers were not warm, not cozy, not insulated. They were stone chimneys with openings big enough to let in entire gusts of Northern European despair. Snow, the slow, cold enemy. Snow is quiet, which is perfect for nighttime misery. When you wake up for early bells during snow season, everything is somehow colder than the night before. Your clothes are cold, your boots are cold, your bones are cold, your dreams are cold. Then you step into the tower, and the cold inside, it's worse, because stone holds cold like a grudge. Snow drifts through open tower arches. It accumulates on the wooden platforms. It melts slowly, creating slick patches you cannot see because medieval lighting technology is basically, I hope this candle doesn't go out. And then you have to grip the rope with numb fingers. Have you ever tried to do delicate work when you can't feel your hands? Bell ringing is not delicate, but it becomes deeply unpleasant when your joints stop cooperating. Also, when bells are cold, the pitch changes. People noticed that. People complained about that. And who did they blame? You, of course. Because medieval logic is consistent in only one way. Fog, nature's way of mocking you. Fog in medieval towns was thick. We're talking, where did the street go? Thick. Where was there a building here? Thick. When fog settled in, it created a surreal world where sound moved strangely. The bells echoed in unexpected ways, sometimes louder, sometimes duller, sometimes bouncing back from distant buildings. People got confused. They'd hear the bells and think they were coming from the wrong direction, or at the wrong time, or that the tone sounded different. So, naturally, they blamed you for ringing incorrectly. Fog is also disorienting inside the tower. At higher levels, fog can seep through the arches, making everything ghostly and damp. If you ever wanted your job to feel like working inside a cloud that smells faintly of wet rope and pigeon, this is your moment. Heat, the rare but very real menace. Medieval Europe wasn't known for blistering summers, but heat waves did happen, and when they did, bell ringers suffered. Hot weather made the bell chamber stuffy, the air thick, the ropes softer and less cooperative, and the bells themselves slightly unpredictable. Also, bells made of bronze expand in heat. just a little, but enough to cause weird ringing patterns or slight distortions in tone. Guess who gets blamed for those? Yes, still you. Storms. When everyone panics and you regret your career. Storms were dramatic events in medieval towns. Rain, thunder, lightning, people took it all very personally. It was common belief that bells could ward off storms. So when thunderstorms rolled in, someone inevitably ran to the bell ringers and shouted, "Ring quickly before the lightning strikes us all!" And so there you are, standing in a giant stone lightning rod, ringing enormous bronze conductors during an electrical storm. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. But fear not. Historically, bell ringers did die from lightning strikes. Enough of them that certain countries enacted laws forbidding bell ringing during storms. You know it's bad when medieval governments say, "Actually, let's not do the traditional thing. People keep exploding." We've covered weather, architecture, ghostly fog, and the treacherous joys of feast days. Now it's time to drift downward into your own body, your medieval bell ringer body, and all the ways it quietly starts to revolt against you. Because while bells are heavy, towers are unsafe, and clergy are impatient, your body is the one thing that will eventually betray you in subtle, cumulative, exhausting ways. Hands, the original medieval battle scars. Your hands are the first to suffer. Every rope-tugging motion creates friction. Every bell pull bruises muscles and joints. Every misstep on stairs leads to accidental rope burns. Over time, your hands develop deep calluses, open sores, small cuts you don't notice until later, blisters that never quite heal, and a faint, lingering smell of bronze and rope fibers. People admired the bells. Nobody admired your hands. In fact, most medieval records treat the bell ringer as almost invisible, like a ghost whose hands are perpetually sticky with rope grime. And the worst part? The damage is cumulative. There's no day-off protocol. Your hands just get progressively less capable.
And you adapt. Slowly, painfully, miserably. Back, shoulders, and neck. The tower gym you didn't sign up for. Every day involves climbing hundreds of spiral stairs, hauling rope over pulleys, bracing yourself against swinging metal, leaning awkwardly to keep rhythm, all of which adds up to chronic musculoskeletal pain. Your back becomes a collection of complaints. Your shoulders feel like they belong to someone else. Your neck aches for reasons you can't fully articulate. If you went to a medieval healer, they'd probably prescribe herbal compresses, prayers, maybe a little massage from someone equally underpaid, or just the standard, suck it up, you're doing God's work. Which, honestly, is not comforting, but it is historically accurate. Hearing loss, the slow, relentless punishment. Let's talk ears. Bell towers are loud, constantly, every day, every hour. You wear no ear protection because medieval safety equipment didn't exist. Over time, your hearing diminishes. Some chroniclers refer to bell ringers as partially deaf from birth or softly hearing in old age, which is polite historian language for the bells slowly removed their ability to detect anything other than rope tension and the judgment of clergy. The most ironic part? The louder you rang, the faster you went deaf. And yet the job demanded loud ringing. So the more competent you were at your duties, the less capable you became of noticing anything else in life. Conversation, bird song, street noise, your own thoughts. Respiratory issues. Dust, mold, and pigeons. Medieval towers are full of dust, mold, and pigeon droppings. All three have opinions about your lungs. Rope fibers float through the air, mold grows in corners that no one cleans. Pigeons are unapologetic about their bodily contributions. Over time, bell ringers could develop chronic coughs, mild breathing difficulties, sneezing fits at inconvenient times, and a faint but persistent sense that their chest was slowly cursing them. Again, nobody really cared. If you were alive, congratulations. If you were dead, someone else would climb the tower in your place. General fatigue and sleep deprivation. Now we return to your sleep, or more accurately, the lack thereof. Feast days, emergencies, storm calls, and night tolls mean that sleep is fragmented, short, poorly timed, and rarely peaceful. Some records mention bell ringers collapsing mid-duty or nodding off while holding a rope. This is rarely treated as scandalous. It's just part of the job. Because medieval life in general didn't exactly honor rest, and your profession was basically a contract with fatigue. Mental health, quiet and steady wear. Let's float into something subtler. The psychological toll. You're isolated, you're overworked, you're exposed to constant sensory assault, sound, wind, dust, darkness, awkward heights. You're responsible for notifying the entire town of time, disasters, and celebrations. You might start to feel persistent anxiety, mild irritability, occasional despair, and an uncanny attachment to your few comforts, a corner of the tower, a favorite rope, a day when the weather was slightly less miserable. Some bell ringers coped by creating little rituals, counting rope twists, talking to the bells,
noting the sound of each swing, whispering apologies to the bells for mistakes. Which sounds weird now, but probably helped them survive mentally. It's the medieval version of meditation. Minor injuries that stick around. Accidents in the tower were rarely fatal, but frequently persistent. You could stub your toes on beams, scrape your hands on ropes, sprain your wrist trying to stabilize a heavy bell, get minor burns from candles or lanterns, bruise your shoulder from swinging ropes. All these accumulate, which leads to a bell ringer walking around like a gently creaking machine. Nobody celebrates your resilience. The bell, meanwhile, swings on as if mocking your human fragility. Aging in the tower. Now let's drift forward, gently, through time. If you somehow survive decades as a bell ringer, through frost, storm, plague years, broken toes, rope burns, and clerical judgment, what does your life look like as you age? You're partially deaf. Your back is permanently crooked. Your hands look like miniature landscapes of calluses. You have a chronic cough and sensitive lungs. You are deeply familiar with the taste of dust and pigeons. After years of climbing towers, tugging ropes, and being slightly deaf, something remarkable happens. You begin to understand the bells. Each swing, each toll, each vibration becomes familiar. It's predictable in the way a clock is predictable, but warmer, more alive, more you. Some chroniclers describe the bell ringer's relationship with the bells as almost musical, though it's not music you would necessarily enjoy outside the tower. It's repetitive, meditative, slightly hypnotic, and deeply satisfying in a subtle way. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a meditation app, with more rope burns. Festivals. The bells finally get appreciated. Most days, your work is invisible. Nobody notices the exact timing of your tolls, except to complain when you're slightly off. But festivals are different. Patron saint days, harvest celebrations, coronations, they call for a grand ringing. This is when the bells truly shine, and by extension, when the bell ringer gets a tiny slice of recognition. During these times, bells are rung in sequences that tell stories, signal processions, or mark important moments. The town listens. People cheer, pray, or simply pause to notice the resonance. It's brief, but it's a reward. A moment where your labor becomes visible in a way that's not entirely about scolding you. Even if the recognition is subtle, like a nod from a passing cannon, it's enough to make the arms ache less, the hands sting less, and the heart sigh a little. Competitions. Yes, medieval bell-playing contests. Believe it or not, some towns hosted competitions for bell ringers. These were serious events, though they sound amusing from a modern perspective. The goal was precision, rhythm, volume, and endurance. Winners earned respect, small gifts, or slightly fewer complaints from the clergy. Some competitions lasted hours. Some were judged by visiting dignitaries who probably didn't fully understand what they were hearing. It was like the Olympics, if the Olympics involved medieval rope burns, cold towers, and chronic back pain. And for the few minutes you performed perfectly,
For the crowd that clapped or prayed silently in awe, it felt almost joyful. Almost. Quirky medieval anecdotes. History has preserved a few strange stories about bell ringers. The bell that wouldn't stop swinging. In a small French village, a bell supposedly continued swinging on its own after the ringer left the tower. Villagers were slightly horrified. Historians suggest wind, uneven rope tension, or sheer medieval exaggeration. The ringer probably relieved to be back on solid ground. The pigeon problem. Some towns became pigeon sanctuaries. Ringers developed unofficial techniques for discouraging the birds, including gentle shouting, dangling cloths, or strategic placement of leftover bread. Effectiveness? Debatable. Annoyance level? 100%. Bell names and superstition. Medieval bells often had names, some intimidating, some oddly whimsical. One bell called Old Grim was feared for decades because it supposedly brought misfortune when rung at the wrong time. Bell ringers learned to be cautious with Old Grim, or at least pretend to be. Small pleasures in daily life. Even on ordinary days, the bell ringer found ways to create little comforts. Timing the rope swings to coincide with a favorite rhythm. Enjoying a view from the top of the tower when the town is quiet. Listening to distant birds or church choirs from above, though muffled. Savoring rare sunlight shining through stained glass, casting colors on the stone floors. A cup of ale after a long day. These moments were brief. They were small. They were easily forgotten by history. But for the bell ringer, living in the monotony of towers and bronze, they mattered. Why the profession persisted. Despite all the dangers, discomforts, and chronic pain, bell ringing endured for centuries. Communities depended on bells for timekeeping, warnings, and celebrations. Clergy insisted on precise schedules. Tradition demanded continuity. And bell ringers, stubborn and resilient, accepted the role because it was honorable, stable, and somewhat sacred. It was a profession that offered visibility without fame, responsibility without reward, and rhythm without end. You might think it sounds unbearable, and it was, but there was also purpose, and occasionally moments of quiet, resonant joy. Parting thoughts for tonight. If you close your eyes and imagine the life of a medieval bell ringer now, you hear the distant toll of bronze. You feel the wind through the tower arches. You sense the weight of ropes in your hands. You feel small, fragile, persistent. You are part of a rhythm that has existed for centuries. A rhythm of stone, bronze, rope, and human endurance. A rhythm that is exhausting, absurd, and quietly beautiful in a deeply medieval way. And that, dear listener, is the world you absolutely would not survive for more than a day, yet somehow existed for lifetimes.